Hi, this is Heather Derome from heatherderome.ca and from the Sonatas and Partitas.com. This is a video in the series of the Arranger's Corner and in the sub-series of choosing the right bass notes. So if you're arranging Bach or anyone else from that period for the guitar, do have a look at those other videos because you will probably find them helpful. Because sometimes when Koonce and I were working on our edition of the Sonatas and Partitas, we would come up against something where it seemed like there were options. But then almost invariably, if we look at it long enough and keep coming back to it, we would find that there's actually only one correct answer. So in those other videos, I try to find examples that are pretty straightforward just to get us going. But what I'd like to do in this video is just dig a little bit deeper at some situations that might be a little bit more intricate and not so obvious at first glance. So in the critical notes of our book, Koonce and I wrote about the little schemata, the rule of the octave, that composers were trained with back in Bach's day and before, and even for some time afterwards, and how they use these little, what I call building blocks, or it's like Lego blocks to compose their music. They didn't compose it chord by chord and note by note, in a way a little bit like we're trained now. And also, like, just for example, a very fundamental difference is to encapsulate it. Like, if you know anything about music theory, you've probably studied chords and you've probably studied inversions. And so, for example, if we have a little stack of notes, E, G, C, we would call that a C chord with the third in the bass. We would call it a C chord in first inversion. So this system, this way of looking at music, was very much developed and promoted by Rameau in around 1720. So at that time, Bach was 35 years old. But going back to the rule of the octave, so if we have this E, and we have a G and a C above it, we have a third and a sixth, that would tend to happen because the E is in a C scale. And the third scale degree wants a third and a sixth above it. But let's say we're in the key of A and we have an E. Well, then it's going to want a third and a fifth above it, what we call a root position chord. If we're in the key of E and we have an E in the bass, it'll want a third and a fifth above it. So where that bass note lies in the key, or what scale degree it's on, is what determines what intervals are going to be above that bass note. Or if we want to put it in our more common language, that decides what inversion the chord is going to be in. It's kind of like a roundabout way of saying that if the chord is a tonic or dominant, it'll be in root position. But if it's a different chord, it'll tend to be in first inversion. If that's just a very blanket, very generalized rule. It, of course, isn't like that all the time. But it's just to give an idea of the difference between thinking about it in terms of the rule of the octave and thinking about it in terms of what we now call 1-4-5. So coming back to our first example of having the E in the bass and having a G and a C above it. That would tend to happen also if the bass is moving by step. And then coming back again to what I was describing with these little schemata, these little, it's like what I call them building blocks. It reminds me very much of playing with Lego. Like you have these little Lego blocks and you can lay them side by side and on top of each other, and certain blocks work well side by side and certain other blocks work well on top of each other. And that's what these little schemata are like. And so this bass moving by step, that is like a certain Lego block. And then you would put certain other things on top of it, certain other Lego blocks on top of it. And there's certain Lego blocks that just don't fit. So you have certain Lego blocks that go side by side and other Lego blocks that go above them, holding them together. And that is what I want to start exploring in this video. Because sometimes you can see, especially in the violin music, something that just has a high part. And if you can see that high part in the way of a Lego building block, then you can know which Lego block to put as a low part. So it's not as if you're trying to figure out the bass notes one by one. It's not like you see a chord, choose an inversion, and plunk in a bass note. And especially not if you see a chord that you're saying, oh, well, that's in first inversion, whatever, I'll just stick in a root underneath it and call it the same chord, because that is really not how they thought. It's like rather you see a formula and then you combine it with another formula. So I like to just take a quick step aside and have a small discussion about what we now call implied bass notes. A great proponent of this concept was John Duarte, and I think he may have taken the idea a little bit too far, but as far as I understand it, his premise was that in all the solo string music, basically Bach wrote incomplete music. So he wrote the upper part and all the other parts were quote unquote implied. But it's probably the same attitude that Mendelssohn had when he first performed the Chaconne in public and accompanied it on the keyboard. But the thing is that Bach did write on the score, on the title page, and even on the next page, like several times he wrote without obligatory accompaniment. And in fact, most of that string music is full and complete in and of itself. The bass line and the inner parts are all there. They're just not always on the beats that you expect them to be on. Or sometimes they're not always in the octave you expect them to be on. For example, at the end of the Sarabande of the cello suite that Bach also arranged for the lute. Well, if you have, this is also implied, but our ear fills it in. And in fact, when Bach even arranged it for the lute, I mean, the ear filled it in so much, he just did. I mean, he could have gone. But it's not really necessary, and in some way it's not quite as beautiful. And so it does definitely happen in the solo string music where there are certain isolated notes that are clearly implied, or as in the case of the passage that we're going to discuss in this video, there may be certain formulas that are implied. Or let's say that this music had been written for the keyboard. Those formulas very likely would have been put in there. And people who are used to hearing this keyboard music, when they only hear the upper part, they likely relate to it with a more grounded sense just because they've heard it with its lower counterpart, like pretty much through their whole lives, and they've only heard that type of music. It's not like us who have heard like so much music from before and after. They were very much steeped in the music of their own time. So they were very attuned to actually relating to what was implied. So what I'd like to start doing in the video is look at a passage that Bach wrote for the violin and that he arranged himself for the lute. So this is the Bourrée in the fourth lute suite, or the third violin partita in minor. Now, if we start by just extracting the chord tones from the violin part, we have a G sharp diminished, an E sharp diminished 7, an F sharp minor, and D major 7. Now, again, this is just speaking in the language of our day, the way that we relate to chords. In Bach's term, he would have had those diminished sonorities going above a bass line that moves down by third and up by step. Just different ways of speaking about the same thing, but it does affect how you think of it when you're arranging it. But now what's unusual for Bach in those diminished sonorities is that they have thirds and fifths above the bass. Normally what would be more common with that sonority is to have a third and a sixth above the bass. And so looking at how Bach added in his bass notes, he made it so that now there's a string of 6 3 chords. And equally important, we have a bass that goes down by 3 and up by 2, down a third and up a step. And also looking at the upper part, the solo violin version, looking at the first chord between the bass and the top, we have a fifth, and then the D that comprises the fifth is held over to create a seventh above that E sharp. And then that seventh resolves to a perfect fifth again. And that fifth is again held to create a seventh. So we have this little combination of formulas where you have a fifth held over to create a seventh, resolving to a fifth, and repeating itself. And that's above a bass line that goes down a third and up a step, down a third and up a step. So those are two little formulas that Bach has combined one on top of each other to work. And now looking at Bach's added basses that go down a third and up a step. If you look at the intervals they create on the strong beats, we have alternating thirds and sixths. And that is another common little schema. The basses that go down a third and up a step, creating those intervals, alternating thirds and sixths. So we have a third, a sixth, a third, a sixth. So you can see in this little tiny passage how Bach is just masterfully kind of playing with these different little building blocks and combining them differently and adding a different building block underneath to create a new building block. So now, having made these observations, let's look at the jig from the D Minor Partita. There's only the violin version of this. There's nothing that Bach arranged for it that we can use as a guide, but we can use our knowledge as a guide. So here, the violin part moves by step. So the chords aren't as easily visible, but they're still all there. So first we have D, F, B flat. And in the second beat we have a C and E. On the third beat, it's C, F, A. Now let's just have a look at that second beat, because why do we only have two chord tones? Well, what happens is the ear hears that the B flat is connecting to the A on the third beat. So it hears it as being held over and combined with a C and E. So essentially we get this. So now we have, as intervals above the bass, we have a sixth, and it's held over to be a seventh, and then it resolves to a sixth, and then it's held over to be a seventh, resolving to a sixth, held to a seventh, resolved to a sixth, and then the pattern changes. So that's the 7-6 schema. So now underneath that 7-6 formula, we can use the other formula, same building block, where the bass goes down 3, up by step, down 3, up by step. And so now between the bass and the top, again, we have that common pattern of alternating thirds and sixths. A third, sixth, a third, a sixth, a third, and a sixth, and then it changes for the cadence. Now this passage also offers us a chance to compare their way, the rule of the octave and schemata, with our way of functional harmony, chords, and inversions, because what we have here is just a circle of fifths. There's G minor, going to C, going to F, going to B flat, to E, to A. But, I mean, what if we put all those as root position chords? Because the first one's in root position, then C, F, and now B flat. It's like suddenly when you get to the B flat, it's like, whoa, that's not very good. But there's a sequence, so you want to have the same relationship on every step of the sequence. And so that's something to watch out for and to train your ear that really a root position chord is not an equal substitute for the other, for an inversion. Root position chords do tend to actually work if they're a tonic or a dominant chord. So now, just for interest's sake, just because we're a little more educated on the topic, let's have a look at another movement in the fourth lute suite or the third violin partitas, the jig. So here's this little passage where it looks like Bach has these second inversion chords that are just jumping up and down, sort of checkerboard fashion. way, that's just very unusual use of second inversion chords. I haven't seen that anywhere else in the whole collection of sonatas and partitas. But then looking at what happens with Bach's added bass notes, he gets rid of the second inversion chords, but now he's got like blatant parallel fifths and parallel octaves throughout. And at least on paper, what looks like zero voice leading. Now here, actually, both in the lute and in the violin score, the passage is better understood in 5 voices. So first of all, again, we hear the high notes as sustaining and connecting to the next chord. And also it helps to think of the downbeat of each bar as the tenor and basses being in unison. Now, I just lowered the bass down an octave for clarity for this video. So what we have actually here is a very old schema, the 10-7 schema. And a highly trained ear will never argue with those parallel fifths and parallel octaves because they actually take place over different voices. But the thing is, it does have this sense of unbridled joy and enthusiasm. And you know, Bach's family, they were notorious for their musical jokes and puns in all manner of naughty and nice, honestly. And I can only imagine that he would have delighted in his little attempt at a transgression, we'll call it. So I hope you found this video helpful, especially if you are making arrangements for the guitar of this music. As always, let us know what you think at sonatasandpartitas.com. If you want to find out when new videos are uploaded, you can subscribe to the channel. And there's also a newsletter that you can subscribe to on our website at sonatasandpartitas.com.